Good evening, everyone. My name is Avery Van Etten, and on behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to Nature Hour. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. We protect the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, and Shanks Ferry people, and I hope we care for these lands as well as these Native peoples. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so precious and beautiful that they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore these special places by creating trails and planting trees. These preserves are then opened for you and I to use, to hike, hunt, fish, and birdwatch 365 days per year. Places like Shanks Ferry, Clark, Kelly's Run, Otter Creek, Climbers Run, Welsh Mountain, and many others are protected forever. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. The format of tonight's lecture will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation with 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll include your questions as part of that conversation. This is the last Nature Hour of our 2025 to 2026 winter season. We would love to have you join us for one of our many upcoming outdoor interpretive events. You can learn more and register for those on our website, lancasterconservancy.org, under other upcoming events. The Conservancy is blessed with incredible corporate support, and tonight we want to recognize our annual sponsors, who include the Wenger Group, J Group, Apex Advertising, Clark Associates, Nimblist, Electron Energy Corporation, Eurofins, Dark Container, Moravian Manor Communities, Armstrong World Industries, Richards Energy Group, Lancaster Civil Engineering Company, Commonwealth Financial Associates, PPL, Cargis, CH&E, and Penstone. Thank you also to our generous sponsor, Brook Hills Investment Group, for making educational programming about Shanks Ferry Wildflower Preserve and the native plants it protects possible. And now I would like to introduce tonight's Nature Hour, Discovering Our Spring Ephemeral Wildflowers, presented by Keith Williams. Keith is the Vice President of Engagement and Education at Lancaster Conservancy, where he leads engagement, education, and volunteer programs. Thank you, Keith.
Thanks, Avery, and thanks everybody for joining me for a little bit of time this evening and this fine last evening of winter. I understand, right? Tomorrow's first day of spring. Avery, can you see my slides? Okay.
Yes, looks great.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, perfect timing, right? Last night of winter, and so I have some good news related to that. Parts of our forests are going to start to look like this in just about a month. In fact, they've already started a little bit. And the reason for that is because what's not obvious in this picture, in this wintertime forest, is all this energy that's stored beneath the snow and the soil and the roots, the bulbs, the corms of our spring ephemeral wildflowers seem to just change the scene that looks like this to like that in what feels like a blink of an eye. And so after waiting out the cold, long, dark months, the spring ephemerals bring hope and they bring joy. They fill our forests with early spring color and beauty. And what seems to be a burst of beauty that just kind of appears is actually the culmination of this genius ecological strategy to capitalize on a limiting factor of our forests. And that limiting factor is sunlight. And so these plants that we call ephemeral do all of their growing, reproduction, and store carbohydrates and sugars in their roots and corms to get them through to the next season. And so here in the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock and the Shanks Ferry people before them, we're blessed with this amazing annual rush of color and energy that just seems to burst from the ground. And we call them ephemeral, but that's a totally human kind of perspective. Some of these plants can easily be 30 years old in this slide. And again, they do all their living in that relatively short interval, only a couple of months between when the soil thaws out and when the canopy leafs out and limits that sunlight from reaching the forest floor. And their early strategy supports a reawakening or revving up of the springtime ecology by supporting early emerging insects like this comma butterfly. And I saw my first comma last week, in fact, and then I saw two or three more. It's like, once you see the first one, you see them all. And actually, commas overwinter as adults, and so they're one of the reasons why we see them to emerge first, along with mourning cloaks. Although I haven't seen mourning cloaks yet. I usually don't see mourning cloaks, unfortunately. Then this other beauty, this eastern tail blue, some of the first ones to come out. And of course, this bumblebee. We'll talk more about bumblebees coming up because the emergence time of bumblebees, by no chance, is perfectly timed with the bloom time of some of our spring ephemeral wildflowers. And we'll talk more about that coming up. And so the plants, the beauty of these flowers seems to transfer up the food chain, just like the food that they produce. And they fill the forest with this intense color and beauty. And we're drawn to beauty as humans. And so John O'Donohue is an Irish philosopher and poet, and he wrote that we need beauty because it gives us all these things: a sense of homecoming, a sense of aliveness, a sense of completion, a sense of regeneration, awakening, a sense of compassion, a sense of the invisible world, a sense of the earth. And I feel that, right? So we're drawn to beauty. We're drawn to these beautiful places that are adorned with these incredible wildflowers, places like Shanks Ferry. And so most of what I'm going to talk about tonight is a preserve that we manage, that we own and manage, called Shanks Ferry. But there's a number of other places in the Susquehanna Riverlands region that just flush with these incredible, beautiful beings. And so we're attracted to this beauty, and we tend to kind of single out individual beautiful subjects, like this trillium, from the amazing whole. But I submit that there's even more beauty when we acknowledge the complex reciprocal and interdependent relationships between all beings. And I hope to explore that a little bit tonight, starting with Virginia bluebells. These are some of the most prominent wildflowers, and we're already starting to get the phone calls, and Avery does this amazing job of posting the bloom predictions on our social media channels. And people want to know when's peak color, when's peak color. What they're really asking about is when are the Virginia bluebells going to be at peak? Because they really do dominate the color scene. And the whole thing about flowering is plants don't flower for our benefit, right? We certainly benefit from that, but that's not their purpose. Their purpose is reproduction. Those little blooms are only there to attract pollinators. And we'll talk about pollination and we really have to reframe that whole concept. But the bluebells tend to just kind of dominate that scene. In fact, sometimes at Shanks Ferry, the bluebells are so thick I can almost taste that intense color. But they actually intensify in color with time. The older the bloom, the darker the blue. The younger blooms are typically the paler. And again, it's all about trying to get pollinated. So you can see the different blooms on this one flower, where you've got the younger blooms in the pink, the more mature blooms in the blue, and then you actually see a senescing bloom in the middle there. It's kind of tanned up and going away. And so again, the plants are providing these blooms as a way to entice a pollinator to come in, because the pollinator is going to get in there and they're going after nectar. And in exchange for that nectar, they get pollen all over their body, and they go to the next bloom and they transfer that pollen to the next flower, and that produces a baby, a seed, a fruit. And so that's what it's all about. And they fill this forest with just this intense color. But there's a whole bunch of other plants at work here. And even in the scene right here, you can kind of make out 3 or 4 different species just by eyeballing this. And some of the most prominent ones at Shanks are these trilliums. We have 3 different species of trillium we think anyway, at Shanks Ferry. This one's the nodding trillium. You see that it's all white, beautiful white flower with the creamy center. And then we have this one. That's almost the opposite, right? It's all red. And this one's name is actually called Stinking Benjamin. And then we have, again, to think about pollination differently than what we typically do of, European honeybees. And we'll talk about European honeybees in a minute. Our pollination is done by a lot more than just European honeybees. In fact, it's done by a lot more than bees. And there's a whole other system that's based on things that look and smell like rotting stuff that attract flies for pollination. And this is one of them, that Stinking Benjamin. Then you got Susquehanna trillium, or Trillium flexipes. And we don't exactly know what's going on with Susquehanna trillium. Right now it's listed as a separate species. But you can see it almost looks like a cross between the nodding trillium and the Stinking Benjamin with the red and the white. Either way, it doesn't really matter. You stink. Both the Susquehanna trillium and the Stinking Benjamin are a little bit stinky. And that's because they depend on other insects like flies for pollination. So while we're thinking about stink, and it's not always considered a spring ephemeral, and I think it's really a disservice to this amazing plant. This is a skunk cabbage. They're incredible. So the white around that skunk cabbage is actually ice and snow. And these plants have the ability to generate heat. In fact, a friend of mine, who's one of our lead volunteer land stewards, took a thermal imager out this year and got almost a 10-degree difference in temperature between the hoods on the skunk cabbage and the surrounding ice and snow. So they have this ability to generate heat, to melt the ice and snow, to get a jump on everybody else, to be the first pollinator, first plant to emerge. And so you get pollinated. And so if you look in the middle of it, you see that little globe there. That's the spadix, and you see all these little yellow flowers on it. And once again, that's being pollinated by a big head fly. So a whole different pollination system based on foul-smelling odor, in our opinion, right? Based on the human experience, how we define foul-smelling odors, as opposed to what we typically think of pollination being, nice fragrant smells and pretty blossoms and all that. And then these skunk cabbages, besides being the first things out, besides their ability to generate heat to burst through the ice and the snow cover, turn into this luxuriant forest of these incredibly big, beautiful green leaves. In fact, one of the best memories I have at Climbers Run, I've got a picture of this, is my granddaughter walking underneath these leaves. They're actually taller than she was when she was about 2 years old. It's pretty amazing. And then we've got a bunch of other really cool plants with just wild strategies. And this is one on blue cohosh. Um, we think that name cohosh comes from the Algonquin to mean rough-leaved, or rough surface. And this plant, instead of producing nectar in its bloom, actually produces nectar patches on its leaves. So nectar production is energetically taxing. And so as a plant, again, you're producing nectar not out of the goodness of your heart. You're producing nectar to entice a pollinator. So if you can entice a pollinator with a little dab of nectar on your leaf instead of a whole bunch in a bloom, that's probably to your benefit. And that's what blue cohosh does. Really cool looking plant. Changes complexion through the season. And so when this first emerges from the soil, it looks like this kind of crow's foot. And this bloom is early in the season. You can see it's kind of like got this slate gray hue to it. And that whole emerging plant looks like that, only it's all bent over and then it unfurls and turns into this really cool looking younger blossom. And again, that blossom is going to attract the pollinator because the pollinator is thinking there's a nectar reward there, but then the nectar reward is actually on the leaf. And then over time, they emerge into these pretty small but really brilliant yellow flowers. Other yellow flowers that we're going to see at this time of year are trout lilies, which interestingly enough are named for their leaves. So if you look at the modeling on that trout lily leaf, that looks very similar to the side of a brook trout, the only trout native in the East, right? So rainbows aren't from here; they're from the Pacific, from the West Coast. Browns are European. Brookies are the only native trout that we've got, and so these trout lilies are named after their leaf, which resembles the sides of brook trout. These plants need to be 7 years old before they produce their first flowers. So they are not sexually mature until they're 7 years old. Now think about what we call them, right? Again, we're going back to this term ephemeral, because from our perspective, these plants sprout, bloom, and die all within about a month, maybe 2 months. And so we think from our perspective, from the human perspective, that they're temporary, that they're ephemeral, when in fact they need to be 7 years old before they're old enough to reproduce. And a colony of these might be 200 to 300 years old. And again, looking at our pollinators and really getting away from the idea that our pollination happens by European, not from here, European honeybees. In fact, there's some compelling data that indicates that European honeybees are having a pretty significant negative effect on our native pollinators that are often solitary nesters and not social insects. Like this one, this is a digger bee. Digger bees obviously dig in the soil. It's a pretty cool way of nesting. But look at all the pollen on that being, really powerful pollinator. And then think beyond the hymenopterans, right? Think beyond the bees, which are the hymenoptera. Think even beyond the lepidopterans, the moths and the butterflies. Think about the coleopterans, right? These beetles are pollinators. That's a beetle, and you see all those little grains of pollen on those wing covers, on those elytra. It's obvious that this is an important pollinator for trout lilies. And then we've got Dutchman's breeches. And so Dutchman's are some of the first ones to come up. And they're named after the bloom, the plant. It looks like pants hanging on a clothesline, right? So Dutchman's breeches. Dicentra, the genus, is named after the heavily cut leaf that you can see there. So there's two different species of Dicentra that we're going to talk about, Dutchman's breeches and squirrel corn. But the timing of the Dutchman's breeches is really important, of their emergence and their bloom time. Because what also is not so obvious in this picture, besides all this energy that's stored from last year, from last season, in the bulbs and the corms and the roots of all these plants that we've talked about so far are these, right? Queen bumbles. So bumblebees are social insects. They form relatively small colonies, maybe a couple hundred individuals. And the only one to survive from that colony over the wintertime is a young mated queen, right? So she's going to be the beginning of the new colony. So she's got fertilized eggs on board, and she estivates, she essentially hibernates over the wintertime in a shallow burrow, or sometimes even just beneath a layer of leaves. And so when we start thinking about insect decline and bird decline, which we're seeing right now, we're experiencing that here, we're experiencing globally, but we're seeing that here in Lancaster and York counties. We have responsibility to change that, and we can. These animals often have relatively small home ranges, and so what we do in our backyards really can have a significant effect. And one of the simplest things we can do in our backyards is leave the leaves. It provides critical habitat for so many different organisms, so many different beings, and those young queens are some of those organisms. And so she's been in that burrow, in that shallow hibernacula through the wintertime. And when she emerges, she needs nectar and she needs pollen, and she needs it right now. She's starving, right? She's gone months with no water, with no nutrition. So it's no coincidence that her emergence time is perfectly timed with the bloom time of Dutchman's breeches. Now, what happens if we get a warm spell, like 2 80-degree days like we had last week, that makes the bee come out of estivation 2 weeks earlier than the Dutchman's breeches are in bloom? What happens to that bee, right? So we know that plants emerge and bloom based on photoperiod, the length of daylight, the amount of light, the length of daylight, and also air temperature, right? But photoperiod is a big driver on their emergence and their bloom time. Whereas the emergence time of those bumbles is mostly driven by air temperature. Soil temperature is going to be driven by air temp, right? So the concern is what happens if these emergence times and bloom times become deranged, become decoupled? What happens to those organisms then? Because the bee depends on that plant and that plant depends on that bee. And if that bee's not there to pollinate that Dutchman's breeches, and if that Dutchman's breeches isn't there to give nutrition to the bee, how does that translate? And we're worried. I'm worried about that. We're losing bee species, bumblebee species, really rapidly. And we think that might be a climate-driven thing. That and we're losing insects, and a lot of that is certainly habitat loss. And bumblebees are no stranger to that. In fact, we just paved over the last remnants of rusty patch bumblebee habitat in Illinois to extend a runway on an airport. Knowingly, it's a federally listed endangered species, and we knowingly destroyed its habitat because we needed a bigger runway to get more Amazon stuff in and out of the airport. But bees are having to go up in elevation or latitude in order to survive, and so we think there might be a climate-mediated shift going on here. And so that thing that you see sticking out the front of that bee is not a stinger. They do have a sting. They're hymenopteran. All hymenopteran, bees, ants have the capability of giving you a little sting or a big sting, depending on the kind of hymenopteran we're talking about. That's actually her tongue, and she's using that to get into the nectar because these plants don't make it easy for the pollinator to get the nectar because again, the goal is to get the pollen on the bee and not just give away all your nectar. And so bees have evolved this method of figuring out how to get to that nectar locked away into that beautiful Dutchman's breeches bloom. And this is the other dicentra we were going to talk about, right? Squirrel corn. It looks similar to the Dutchman's breeches bloom, only maybe a little bit more heart-shaped, but the leaf looks very similar. So it's kind of easy to confuse these two when you're just looking at leaves. You see the Dutchman's breeches leaf down there looks very, very similar to this squirrel corn. And squirrel corn is actually named after its roots. So I'm assuming squirrels love it, where the first part of the common name comes from. But the corn part comes from if you were to dig this plant up and look at the roots, it actually looks like little corn kernels, which we do not recommend digging these up at all. One of the big threats we'll talk about towards the end of this that we have at Shanks Ferry is actually plant theft. Love that more and more people are getting involved in native plants, in native gardening and ecological gardening. Critically needed, critically important. We have an entire program called Community Wildlife Habitat. Check out our website on that. But source your plant materials not from the wild. These plants are not going to survive if you dig them up and take them home and plant them in your yard. They are adapted to a very specific microclimate, a very specific soil type. And all you're doing is going to drive the population to extirpation, to local extinction. And that's happening at Shanks Ferry for some of our plant species. Another interesting plant that's named after its roots is cutleaf toothwort. So the cutleaf part is kind of obvious if you take a look at the serrated leaves on that beauty. But the toothwort part is, again, if you were to dig this up and look at the roots on this, it looks like human teeth, like dentition. Again, don't go around digging up the toothwort just to see if it's true or not. And another part of this that just always blows my mind is the relationship not only between the pollinators and the plants. This is millions, 33 million years old relationship as far as we can tell. But the relationship that plants have established with other kinds of insects. So, for example, um, woodland spring wildflowers, 30 to 40% of woodland spring wildflowers are planted by ants. So these plants figured out that ants like sugar and fat. And if they attach a piece of sugar or fat, a little packet of sugar or fat to the seed called a lyosome, the ant's going to grab that and take it back to their colony. And they're going to eat the sugar and they're going to eat the fat off of that seed. And they're going to discard the seed in the best bioturbated, aerated, fertilized soil in the forest, which is their trash heap, the ant's trash heap. And it's going to significantly increase the chances of that seed sprouting and making it to adulthood. So these plants are essentially giving their offspring, giving their babies the best possible chance they have by attaching a packet of sugar or fat to the seed and knowing that the ant is going to come and take it and run it back to their colony. Beyond that, ants make 3 tons of soil a year per acre in our forested ecosystems in the East on average, which is also pretty mind-blowing. These tiny little things that we spend a lot of time trying to squish are really critically important to our ecosystem functioning. This is another neat plant, one of my favorites, red columbine. I grew up in Bucks County on the Delaware River at a place known as the Palisades. These are cliffs that go about 100 feet right up from the river. And these Palisades were covered in red columbine because it likes that ecosystem, right? It likes really thin soils, rock outcrops. And so when you're going to Shanks Ferry, as you're coming off of the Green Hill Road, which is now closed, but that's the gravel road that you're walking in on before you make the left to go up the Gamber Wildflower Trail. There's a rock outcrop right there on the left. It's a limestone outcrop, and it's got red columbine growing on it. Again, these plants are disappearing in the wild because of habitat loss and theft. And as a result, anybody that depends on this red columbine is also going away, just like this columbine dusky wing skipper. So just like a monarch caterpillar depends on milkweed, the dusky wing skipper, a columbine dusky wing skipper, depends on columbine. And so when your host plant goes away, then you too go away. Um, Two different plants going on here. So in the upper left corner, that tiny little white flower is early saxifrage. That's another one that likes these really thin soil, rocky outcrops. You'll find that growing right next to the columbine, right there at that first outcrop at Shanks. And then this other one, the spring beauty, Claytonia. Find them all over the place. And look at the pollen that produces. There's another digger bee just loaded up. The bees have these pollen baskets on their hind legs. And you can just see all the pollen from that spring beauty just loaded up on that digger bee's pollen basket. And again, thinking beyond the bee as the only pollinator, there's a beetle on the Claytonia, also pollinating. Anything that goes and brushes against the bloom on the flower is a pollinator. And there's another beetle, ground beetle. These are really cool plants. And I think if we ever wanted proof of life on another planet, of alien life, this is it, right? These are these crazy umbrella-looking plants. These are Mayapples. Really, really, and this is probably a clone. All those plants, all those umbrellas you see there is probably genetically the same individual. They're clonal, which is also mind-blowing. And that's the early bloom. And if you remember the Audrey 2 on Little Shop of Horrors, remember the carnivorous plant, and it was Audrey 2, and like feed me, Henry. Well, that thing, that little bloom right there, that pre-bloom, starts to look like that carnivorous plant. And so I think this might have been inspiration for Audrey 2. but they get this really cool white blossom. Box turtles love these, by the way. The little fruits that are produced by the mayapple, box turtles go crazy for them. Box turtles are in steep decline, so anything that we can do to keep mayaples on the landscape is a good thing for box turtles. Box turtles are in steep decline because of habitat loss and because of poaching. People take them and keep them as pets. And this Jack in the Pulpit is often not considered a spring ephemeral um, because it's usually late in the season, right? So Jack in the Pulpits are kind of like late May into June, but they're so prominent in our eastern woodlands, especially our more rich eastern woodlands. I need to include it that the pulpit is that hood, and then inside is the spadix, is the Jack, and then later in the season, the female plants produce these really brilliant clusters of red berries. And so if you see a big cluster of brilliant red berries on a herbaceous stalk, about a foot off the ground in the forest, those are Jack in the Pulpits. And then golden ragwort, Pacra aurea. This is a really cool plant. So it starts out low to the ground, it kind of looks purpley, and then as it grows taller and it ages, it gets this beautiful golden bloom to it. It's really aggressive. It's a native plant, really, really aggressive. So if you're going to plant it, just be aware of that. At the same time, that aggressive nature might have some benefit to outcompeting some of the invasives that we're dealing with, and we'll talk about those coming up. But this is a potential treatment method for some of our more troublesome invasive plants, rather than going with a chemical. And woodland phlox, right? So again, later in the season, there's this progression of the bloom, starting early on with things like bloodroot and Dutchman's breeches, and then typically middle of the bloom time, we're looking at the trillium at peak, and then the Virginia bluebells, and then later in the season, we start seeing the woodland phlox, and so just beautiful clusters. You can see how almost everything else in this picture is done blooming, right? It's over. You see a couple of remaining trilliums. The bluebells are done, but there's the phlox kind of picking up the color charge and keeping our woods in color. And then here's bloodroot again, named after the root. So if you dig this up and you cut the root, it bleeds. Again, please don't do that. One of the earliest spring ephemeral wildflowers to come up. I think we had some reports of some of these starting to pop already. Interestingly enough, there's no nectar in that plant. As juicy as that bloom looks, nope, not a drop. So it's all a ruse. And interestingly enough, if you see those insects on there, those are midges. So those are basically aquatic insects that spend most of their lives underwater in a freshwater stream and emerge as these winged flies. And there they are on bloodroot doing the pollination work. This is Star of Bethlehem, not native, really, really problematic at some of our preserves. We are really fighting a big battle with this at Climbers right now, where we worked on one of our great well, he's a staff person, but he's also a volunteer. Day Meyer spends a lot of time fighting this stuff in a meadow that he's working on restoring. Um, but look at that bee on there. That's a metallic sweat bee, an adrenid bee. Beautiful, beautiful bees. They're some of those are might form small colonies. Some are individual nesters, often in dead wood. But look at all the pollen on that individual, right? He's like, wow, one heck of a party emerging from that Star of Bethlehem. But just because you see a pollinator on a plant covered in its pollen doesn't mean it's good for it, right? I mean, we do things that aren't good for us, right? Well, they do the same thing, and not all nectar and not all pollen is created equal. So, for example, I planted butterfly bush all over my yard when bush was available. I guess it still is available. When I thought I was doing the right thing by planting butterfly bush, and I thought I was doing the right thing because of the butterflies loved it. I mean, they all went crazy for it. And so how could it be wrong if the butterflies were covering, the sprays of the purple and the white blooms? But turns out that the nectar had the nutritional equivalent of us eating at McDonald's every meal. So not all nectars are the same. And just because pollinators are utilizing a plant, especially a plant that's not native to here, doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing for that pollinator. And here's another example, right? So Veronica speedwells are these beautiful little blue flowers, and they're in bloom right now. You probably find them in your lawn if you went looking for them. Not native to here. And then that beautiful being on that speed well looks like a bee, right? Has the same kind of coloration. It's actually a dipteran. Dipterans are flies. Diptera, two-winged. Most insects have four wings, and that keeps them from barrel rolling, right? When one set of wings are up, the other set of wings is down, and it counterbalances. What Diptera do is they have these little structures called halteres that look like little dumbbells that are right behind that front wing. And those dumbbells act as that kind of counterbalance to keep that bee, no, that hoverfly in this case, pointed in the right direction and not doing barrel rolls. And so this is called the hoverfly, again in the dipteran family. But look at all the pollen on that, right? It's a bee mimic, and it's mimicking bees for a reason. You know, if you look like a stingy thing, then somebody else is going to think they're going to get stung in the process of bothering you, and so you're less likely to get bothered if you look like you're a stingy thing. And so that's what these hoverflies do. And there's another one, Scylla. We have this at Shanks. And here's a one that's an emerging threat, and one that we are really struggling to figure out how to fix. Lesser celandine. Um, it's shiny leaf with the yellow flowers, and it winds up looking like that, right? Pretty soon, all of our stream valleys in the region are going to look like this, and everybody's like, "Oh, look how pretty!" Yeah, not really. Um, this patch right here should have at least a half a dozen, if not a dozen, different spring ephemeral wildflowers in it. And it's a monoculture, right? And that's the threat of things that are invasive. Typically, things that are invasive are usually not from that ecosystem, right? That gives them the capability of uncontrolled population growth because the typical population controls, like disease processes or herbivory, things that are going to eat you to control your numbers, or things that are going to kill you by making you sick and killing you, aren't part of that ecosystem yet. And so you wind up kind of taking over, and that's exactly what we see going on here. You can see right in the middle the Dutchman's breeches, right? The dicentra, and then you see all surrounding it is the celandine, and this is really hard to control. You can't. It's a perennial, and it's a prolific seeder, and so it's two of the worst possible things, right? It produces a ton of seed, and it's a perennial plant, and the rootlets are these tiny little gravel-sized bulblets, so it's impossible to dig it all out. I was string trimming this at Shanks Ferry. We had this growing in the stream corridor at Shanks Ferry right now, and I was string trimming it, thinking, right, that if I string trim this before it sets seed, at least I'm not letting that population grow, right? I'm not doing anything to kill the plant necessarily because, it's a perennial, but at least the population is not, it's not producing more seed. Well, it turns out these plants produce bulblets before it produces seed. And so by string trimming, I was probably just spreading the bulblets all over the place. We see this stuff starting to climb the hills at Shanks Ferry, and we think that might be because those tiny little rootlets get hung up in the hooves of deer, and as they go from the stream valley up into the uplands, the plants are getting transplanted essentially by the deer. And we're not sure how to control this stuff yet. We're experimenting with a couple different control measures, and one of those that we're looking at right now, we haven't started with it yet, but the idea that Pacra aurea, that golden ragwort, might outcompete this stuff, might be where we land. Other yellow flowers that we don't want to control are violets. We've got a bunch of different species of violet. We've got yellows and blues and whites, and these are native and they're really, really beneficial. Some of the earliest pollinators depend on those violets that are coming up in our yards. So it's recommended you don't control those. And this particular individual, this beautiful regal fritillary butterfly, eastern regal fritillary, one population of these left in the country, and that's at Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania. It's an Army Reserve training base, and so it's firing range, and firing ranges catch fire because you're throwing stuff down range that blow up and start fires. And if you're throwing something down range and it starts a fire, and you have a whole bunch of unexploded ordnance, you're not going to put firefighters on the ground to go fight that fire. You're going to let it burn. Well, regal fritillaries depend on that fire frequency. They depend on low intensity, high frequency fire that produces a prairie-like ecosystem, and they depend on violets as part of their host plant structure, right? They've got a pretty complex life history, so it's not as straightforward as host plant and nectar plant. But there's over 1,000 individuals at Fort Indian Town Gap, and you go tour them in May. So keep an eye on go to check out the Fort Indian Town Gap Wildlife Department webpage for tour dates. They run 4 days a year about where you can go out and do a tour with a butterfly biologist. And they're doing amazing work at not only protecting that particular population, but captive breeding them in a partnership with the Game Commission and Zoo America to try to establish other populations elsewhere in the state. So it's encouraging work. It'd be a real shame if we lost that beauty from this planet. And these are some of the things that we're losing, that we've lost essentially. Regal fritillaries used to be at other places in Lancaster and York County, other places in the state besides Fort Indian Town Gap. That's the rusty patch bumblebee at the very top right that I was telling you about that used to be here, aren't here anymore. Real shame that the Belleville Prairie got bulldozed over and turned into a runway because there was an active population of rusty patch there, and we as a society said it was okay to get rid of them in exchange for a longer runway so we get more Amazon crap. And then we've got the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus. That's the one in the middle. Pennsylvanicus is its specific name, and there's one population left in the state, and that's in suburban Philadelphia. Bumblebee with pennsylvanicus as its specific name, and we're letting it go away. We ought to be ashamed of ourselves in this state. And that lower one, that beauty, is a frosted elephant, and that's just 4 examples of 20 or 30 individuals, of beings, of different kinds of beings, different species of insect, that are no longer here in York and Lancaster counties in my lifetime, right? This isn't something that happened after European colonization. This happened more recently in the last 40, 50 years. And this is what we see, right? So the lepidopterans are 30% down from 1970 to now. That's the orange line. Lepidopterans are the moths and the butterflies. And then all other invertebrates is the red line. And granted, invertebrates include a whole bunch of other organisms besides insects, like the mollusks and things like that. But certainly the insects make up the bulk of the invertebrates. And so we can kind of interpret that 70% decline as a 70% decline in insect abundance from 1970 to 2010. And it's because of this, right? It's habitat destruction. That's the driver. And it's death by 1,000 cuts for sure. When you look at bird decline, when you look at plant decline, when you look at insect decline, you look at amphibian decline, reptile decline. But this is a common denominator across all taxa. It's habitat loss. There's not going to be any Dutchman's breeches coming up on this site, and there's not going to be any bumblebees emerging from their hibernacula, and there's not going to be any nectaring going on. And this is number 2, invasive species, right? And this is garlic mustard. This is a plant, and that's evil genius plant. So most plants need vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizae, or VAM, around their roots to help them transfer nutrition and nutrients from the surrounding soil into their root. What garlic mustard does is it puts a fungicide into the soil to kill off that fungi, right? That VAM, which then essentially kills off the competition. The only beautiful thing of this is, well, there's 2 beautiful things. One is it tastes good. It makes a great pesto. And number 2 is it's a biennial plant. So if we pick it before it produces seed, we're stopping its progression, right? And another threat are photographers, and that's me. And I'm guilty of this. I try not to be though, right? I see a picture that it's a trillium, and it's only 2 steps off the trail. That's it. It's just 2 steps. And so I take 2 steps, and I get the shot of the trillium. Well, multiply my 2 steps by the 300 people that visit Shanks Ferry on a weekend day, Saturday or Sunday, through the season. All of a sudden, it's 600 steps go into the same trillium, and it has a negative effect. And then dogs off lead, trample, they dig things up, they diminish other preserve users' experience. Not everybody's a dog person. That's my dog. I am a dog person. That's in my yard, so she's under control. I'm not saying do as I say and not as I do. But they damage. They damage the spring of fun wildflowers. They disrupt wildlife, and they diminish preserve user experiences. And then finally, plant theft. That's another threat. And that's my hand, and that's at Shanks Ferry. And I'm at the beginning of the Gamber Wildflower Trail, and I'm digging out a patch of lesser celandine. And for those of you who know the region, there's a rail line that runs right along between the river and the Shanks Ferry Preserve. It's an active freight line. And right next to that is a gravel road that is for official railroad use only. And it's locally known as the Drunk Highway because you can get from, I don't know, it's about a 10-mile stretch on that gravel road and escape law enforcement detection. And so if you're inebriated, you take that drunk highway to get home without getting a DUI. Although why you would want to drive inebriated between a river and a rail line that's active, I don't know. Anyway, I'm out there on a Monday morning. It's about mid-morning, and I'm digging up a patch of celandine. And I hear this beat up pickup truck rattling down the drunk highway, and it stops, and the door opens, and I'm like, oh man, I really don't feel like dealing with anybody today, especially not somebody driving the drunk highway. And this guy gets out of the truck and he yells at me, he says, "Hey, you, quit stealing those plants." And I was like, "Hey, thanks, man. I work here, but thanks, you restored my faith in humanity." Um, so any one of those things, right? A misstep because I want to take a picture, a dog off lead, a trowel because I want trout lilies growing in my garden bed, development, a house getting put here, or garlic mustard, an invasive plant, eliminates this colony that might be 200 or 300 years old. Each one of those flowers that you see is on a plant that's at least 7 years old. That's the driver right there, right? Development, habitat loss due to development, habitat loss due to decline quality because of invasives. And we as a conservancy are not against development, right? We just think it needs to be done in the right way in the right place. And then when we protect land that we think is just too special to be developed, then we store that land, which means we take care of it and we have to get rid of those invasives. And that's a big part of our stewardship program is invasive species control. Because this is the result of that, right? We see bird decline, we see insect decline, we see that decline in beauty that John O'Donohue told us we need as a species, and I think he's exactly right. And this is how we answer that, right? We've got 54 preserves. We protect over 10,000 acres on 54 different preserves in York and Lancaster County. We're the answer to these problems. We can't do it without your help. This is a good example. These are our volunteers. We have over 100 active volunteers that help us do everything from teach K through 12 students the importance of conservation to greeting preserve visitors when they come out to Shanks Ferry or Kelly's Run or any of our other busy preserves to make sure everybody feels welcome, make sure they know where they're going, make sure they know what they're looking at, ensure that they're keeping the preserve safe and that they're staying safe, or help us do land management by removing garlic mustard. Last year, our volunteers removed 6,000 gallons of garlic mustard from Shanks Ferry, which means a place that looked like this now looks like this. We can see real, tangible, on the ground impact that our volunteers have on our preserves. And that has an effect on these lines, right? These trends, the negative slopes on these graphs, don't have to define our future. Our past doesn't have to define or dictate our future. We can change the slope on those on those graphs so that we're not in a 30% decline of leps and a 70% decline in all other insects. We don't have to say goodbye to these individuals. We can bring them back. And you can work with us to help us keep it wild. So thanks, everybody. If you want to learn more, check us out. I'm going to stop sharing so I can answer some questions here. But check out our website. We've got a lot of information about all of our preserves. We're going to start having volunteers at Shanks Ferry to welcome preserve visitors and make sure that folks are staying on trail. And we have this amazing field guide that our communications team has developed that we give out to preserve visitors. So we got a question in the Q&A. Are the common violets that most people want to remove from their yards as a weed? Yeah, they're native. So those purple ones that are really, really common are a native plant, and they've got some real benefit. Even dandelions that aren't native are recommended by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources that we leave them in our lawns too, because they do provide an important nectar source. So, but yeah, those purple violets are really critically important. So leave them in your lawn if you got them. Best estimate for bloodroot bloom at Shanks or other areas. Boy, that's a tough one, and I think it's early. Although I haven't seen it up yet, but I would imagine that bloodroot we're going to start seeing in the next week, I think. And then we'll start making regular predictions on our social media channels. Avery takes care of all that. So keep an eye on our socials, and we'll start doing those predictions. In fact, I'm heading out there tomorrow, and so I will do another assessment and make another installment to Avery, who will then upload everything to socials because I'm not that savvy on the social media. So anyway, folks, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Again, this is our last nature hour of the 25-26 series. Now we start going live and outside. So join us outside. Got another question about overpopulation of deer and how much of a problem. They're a huge problem. The deer define the flora, right? So anything the deer don't eat are going to be hyper abundant. Um, and the things that they do eat are going to get pruned right out. So they have a really significant degree of control on on the flowers, the shrubs, and even the trees that we have growing in our woods right now. And I think Avery's putting some links in the chat to our community wildlife habitat program, to the Shanks Ferry Preserve that you can learn specifically about that preserve. And we have a couple of interpretive events coming up there. So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate you spending the time with us. And we will see you on Nature Hour 20, wow, 27, 28. Thanks again, everybody.